In the summer of 1974, a massive mountaineering camp was set up in the southern part of the Soviet Union, with over 170 daring hikers ready to take on the challenge of climbing Lenin Peak. Among them were 8 fearless Russian women who were determined to make history by becoming the first all-female team to conquer the peak. However, during their descent, they got pinned on top of the mountain in one of the worst storms in 25 years. Instead of a triumphant climb, it ended up becoming one of the worst disasters in mountaineering history. Lenin Peak is the highest mountain in the Trans-Alai range of Central Asia. For mountaineers, it is considered one of the less technical 7,000-meter peaks in the world to climb. And perhaps that's why Elvira Shatiova chose Lenin Peak for her all-female ascent of the mount. Shatiova was a Russian professional mountain climber and a professional athlete. At the time of her death in 1974, she was one of the most famous climbers in the USSR. Another reason for why she chose Lenin Peak could be the fact that she had summited the mountain before, so she was an experienced hiker and she was familiar with the mountain. However, those other times she had summited the mountain, she had been part of a mixed group with, among others, her husband, Vladimir Shatiova, who would go on to write of the experience on Lenin Peak in his memoir. The team consisted of 8 experienced mountaineers, and their plan was to become the first all-female ascent of Lenin Peak. I did mention that Lenin Peak is considered one of the less technically difficult peaks in the world to climb, but that doesn't mean that the mountain is easy to ascend. Lenin Peak offers challenges in the form of unstable weather, frosty temperatures, and avalanche risks. This, combined with the altitude, has led many amateur attempts to fail. In June 1974, 170 climbers from several different countries occupied a huge international mountaineering camp in the southern part of the Soviet Union. On the border of what is now Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, the camp was in the Premiers, which has some of the world's highest mountains. Of these 170 climbers, there were 19 Americans, of which 2 were women. They attended as part of the 1974 American expedition. Many of these climbers have told their version of the events that transpired in 1974. One of the women who was there was named Molly Higgins, and she remembers meeting Elvira Shatiova for a brief moment and finding her inspirational. Another woman, Arlene Blum, was there with a Swiss team, and she recalls speaking briefly with Shatiova and how Shatiova told her that her group's aim was to become the first all-female team to conquer Lenin Peak. While Blum and Shatiova bonded over the common goal of giving women the chance to climb high mountains, Blum also expressed some concerns over the equipment that Shatirova's team had with them. She points out that they had tents with button closures and very old-fashioned boots, and given how Lenin Peak had pretty unstable weather, she wondered if that equipment would be enough. This is the sequence of events as told by the other climbers on Lenin Peak. During this entire ascent, the climbers at base camp maintain radio contact with those on the mountain. On July the 30th, the Russian team left base camp for Camp 1. Then the next day, they proceeded towards the summit, taking the Lipkin route. The hike would go really well. Then, on August the 3rd, Shatiova called a rest day. The base camp had gotten reports of cloudy weather and problems getting over to Camp 3 in whiteout conditions. A whiteout is a surface weather condition in a snow-covered area in which no object casts a shadow. This means that visual references like the horizon or terrain features are significantly reduced or completely blocked. On August the 4th, there were reports of a major storm, and recommendation was that all climbers on the mountain would descend. Shatiova's team was seen walking in a line, perhaps 400 feet below the summit. Then, the next day, August the 5th, the team would radio from the summit. They had made it to Camp 3, and they had reportedly been told by a Soviet climber that a storm was predicted and that they shouldn't try to climb. But given that the air remained fairly calm and clear, the team decided to try anyway. But then that same day at 5 p.m, the team radioed base camp and informed them that the visibility had gotten so bad that they had chosen to set up their tents to try and wait for a break in the storm. What happens after that differs a bit. According to Elvira's husband, Vladimir Shatyova, base camp agreed and told them that they had two choices: go with the plan of waiting out the night, or descend immediately if that is possible. Another account by Robert Craig, in the book Storm and Sorrow, notes that the base camp told them to wait out the night, but to descend first thing in the morning on the same trail that they had ascended, which was the Lipkin route. So the team waited out the night, and then on the morning of August the 6th, Shatyeva would radio reports of the winds getting worse. The team had tried to descend, but they only managed a few hundred feet. Hurricane-force winds had hit in the early morning hours after midnight, which exploded the tents and blew away rucksacks, stoves and mittens. This left 5 women huddled in one tent, without poles, and 3 sleeping bags. Then, on August the 7th, Shatyova's team would radio again and report their struggles with sustained whiteout and worsening wind. They also reported that one of the women had become ill, and another of them seemed unwell. The head team told them to descend, to try and reach snow in which they could dig caves for shelter. According to Robert Craig, it was implied that if the women who had fallen ill couldn't move, and they couldn't achieve adequate shelter, the group should leave her for the good of the group as a whole. As the women descended, one of them, Irina, would die. She froze to death while holding a safety rope for the others. The team would attempt to dig caves, but they found themselves unable to do so in the hard snow. They did manage to put up 2 tents on a ridge, only several hundred feet below the top. At this point, the climbers who are ill deteriorated even more, and the team were told that those who could still move should try to continue their descent. This time, Shatyova said that she understood, and that she would try. The exact timeline after this is unclear, since the accounts vary, but either that day or the next day, the women who were ill had died. The morning of August the 7th, 2 Japanese climbers set out to try and help, but the winds were so strong that they were blown off their feet and couldn't continue, so they had to go back. Other climbers on the mountain also tried to help, but all of them were far lower down the mountain. Shatyova was asked whether or not they were trying to descend. She replied that 3 of the women had now gotten sick and only 2 remained who were functioning, but they too were getting weaker. She also stated that they could not and would not leave anyone behind after all they had done. These were the last transmissions by the team. At 10 a.m., it is very sad here where it was once so beautiful. At 3:30 p.m., we are sorry we have failed you. We tried so hard. Now we are so cold. At 5 p.m., the transmission is unclear, but another woman seemed to have died, which left only 3 remaining hikers. Then, at 6:30, another has died. We cannot go through another night. I do not have the strength to hold down the transmitter button. The final transmission will come at around 8:30 p.m. on August the 7th. Now we are 2, and now we will all die. We are very sorry. We tried, but we could not. Please forgive us. We love you. Goodbye. According to Shatyova, the last speaker wasn't his wife, but Galena, and he also writes that someone pressed the radio button 2 more times, trying to contact the base, and after that, there was only silence. On August the 8th, the storm was over, and the American team set out for the summit with no idea of what had happened in the days before. They would stumble over the first body on the face below the summit, who they all recognized as Shatyova. They could see signs of others further up the slope. Around this time, the Japanese team would also arrive, and the American team would borrow their radio to call base camp and inform them of their find. A week later, Elvira's husband and a support crew went up the mountain to retrieve the bodies. The reasons for this tragedy are many, one reason being the poor equipment as noted by Blum. Shatyova's team had cotton tents with button closures and wooden poles, which wasn't a match for the strong wind, which, according to Robert Craig, had wrecked 2 tents the first night. The team was also under a lot of pressure, both as the first all-female team, but also given the fact that there were many other teams present. Many men in Russia did not think that they could do it, and Shatiova wanted to prove them wrong. Also, as noted by Blum, this was during the Cold War, and America was in competition of sorts with the Russians. This is believed by some of the hikers to be one of the reasons for why the team decided to wait until visibility improved. They did not want foreigners, especially Americans, to think that Russians were quitters. There's also the fact that Shatiova felt great responsibility for her team, something that was noted by many of the other climbers present. The women were very loyal to each other, and they did not want to leave anyone behind. Many of the other hikers that were present in 1974 feel conflicting feelings over the question of would you have stayed with everyone, or would you have left the ones unable to continue behind? Unless you've actually been in that situation, no one can say for sure what they would have done. We can't really overlook the fact that Shatiova planned to be the first all-female team who climbed Lenin Peak. That probably also played a part in some of the decisions that were made. Shatiova knew that if they were successful, there were many who would try to downplay that success. For instance, when she was informed of the snow, and of course the decreasing visibility, she actually said that she was glad for the snow at first, because it covered their tracks, and that would remove any talk of these women ascending a longer trail. Her husband also speculated that it is possible that the reason she called a rest day on August the 3rd is because they were intentionally dragging out the climb. The reason for this could be that 3 teams of Soviet men had been coordinated to provide support if needed, and it is possible that Shatiova wanted to break away from that. So she called the rest day to drag out the climb some more. But in hindsight, perhaps if they hadn't stopped to rest on August the 3rd, they might have reached the top one day earlier, which meant that they would have been further down the mountain when the storm hit. The idea of an all-female team ascent isn't a new one. It has been done on other mountains. For instance, in 1952, Jan Kohn and Jane Shoaker went on to become the first all-female ascent on Devil's Tower in Wyoming, United States. But perhaps more famously than that is Junko Tabby, who became the first woman to summit Mount Everest in 1975. She had also been part of an all-female team, but Everest being Everest, she unfortunately ended up being the only one of her team to reach the summit. Now, all of the women from her team survived, but they all had to turn back for different reasons, and Tabby could easily have been one of those who turned back. For instance, at 9,000 feet, her team was hit with an avalanche while they were camped. Junko ended up buried and knocked unconscious, but she was pulled from the debris by the 6 Sherpas who had accompanied the team. Her injuries left her unable to walk for the next 2 days, but she was determined. 12 days after that avalanche, Junko Tabby would be the first woman to ever summit Everest, and she did it on her hands and knees. Junko Tabby and her team also faced opposition when they tried to put their expedition together. They struggled to find funding for their trip, and they were reportedly told that they should be home raising children instead. But they were determined, so they made their own sleeping bags. They collected the leftover jam packets from school lunches, and they made goods from recycled materials to sell as fundraisers. Mountain climbing used to be done by male colonial explorers before it became recreational in the 1800s. In 1808, 18-year-old Marie Paradis of France became the first woman to ever summit Mount Blanc, which is the highest peak in Western Europe. The second woman to climb Mount Blanc would be Henriette Yanceyville, 30 years later. And over the years, more and more women would conquer various mountains in the world. The bottom line is, women have always been present in these spaces, one way or another. So going back to the Shatiova team, based on the observations from other hikers present at Lenin Peak those days in 1974, a lot of factors seem to be the cause for this tragedy. Like I said, Shatiova and her team were under a lot of pressure, both given the fact that it was still during the Cold War, and also the fact that many Soviet men did not think women had any place in the mountains. However, not all the hikers share that sentiment. Jed Williamson, who was one of the hikers present at Lenin Peak in 1974, said in 2019, Personally, the pessimistic side of me can't help but wonder if the less than ideal equipment that the women had was intentional. That maybe they were given crappy equipment in the hopes that they would fail, and thus give up the idea of women mountaineering. Not to mention the fact that the women's team were assigned 3 different male teams to assist them. It does kind of seem like everyone expected, or perhaps wanted them to fail. From the accounts of the other hikers, Shatiova also seemed like a very proud woman. Molly Higgins remembers her saying, Master of Sports of Russia is a sports title in the Russian Federation, one that Shatiova was clearly very proud of. In the end, Shatiova and her team appear to have fallen victims to the same 2 things that have claimed lives on mountains all over the world: equipment that didn't hold up against the sudden storm, and pride that was more than likely at stake given the fact that many expected her to fail. According to her husband, Shatiova's team was a very disciplined yet congenial unit. They were all experienced climbers, and they were determined to see this through. A determination that was shared by Junko Tabby and her team only a year later. But where Tabby was ultimately successful, Shatiova wasn't. But she and her team still displayed amazing courage and loyalty. And even though they weren't successful in the end, I do think that the story of Shatiova and her team can still be seen as a cautionary tale, but also an inspirational tale, because they tried to do something that no one thought that they could do. And even though they failed, in the end, they still did more than many others would. This has been Gripping Horror, and I hope to see you in the next one.